Hello, this is the third part of the Unit 1 reading assignment. And now we're going to this question again. What is a language? If we look at this map of the world again and we assume that each little tiny red dot represents one language, I want to discuss a contemporary issue of why it is difficult to assume that one of these dots represents one language. While it seems fairly straightforward to establish language families based on shared innovations over time, it can be difficult to define the actual entities we call languages or dialects. The question when something is a language or a dialect of a language complicates the question for the exact number of languages on Earth. In other words, it is difficult to determine the actual number precisely because it is difficult to define a language even in the present. The question where one language ends and another begins is not simply an issue of linguistic features, but instead a complex amalgam of historical, geographical, cultural, political, and social aspects. It's helpful to consider some concrete examples from more recent history to make this clear. So, in this unit I have two case studies. The first one is the Balkan region of the country formerly known as Yugoslavia, that now is split up into different nation states. And let me explain how this led to the language formerly known as Serbo-Croatian to split up into several other languages. The Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was a federation of 6 states: Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Slovenia, and Serbia, and 2 autonomous provinces, Vojvodina and Kosovo, until 1991. The official language of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was called Serbo-Croatian. After the devastating period of civil war over ethnic and religious conflicts that began in 1991, the country disintegrated into separate sovereign states, now called Croatia, Slovenia, and Macedonia, established in 1991. The state of Bosnia and Herzegovina was established in 1992, and after a complicated process of peace negotiations through the United Nations, the state of Serbia was established in 2006. In the aftermath of the dissolution of Yugoslavia, the official languages in the new states are now known as Bosnian, Serbian, and Croatian, Slovenian, and Montenegrin. This process of disintegration of a once unified country into separate states, primarily along ethnic and religious lines, is now often referred to as Balkanization. This topic of Balkanization is coming up in other aspects of this course, so keep it in mind. In this process of giving up a unified national whole, the language once called Serbo-Croatian now competes with the languages that were formerly known as regional variations of Serbo-Croatian, or simply dialects of Serbo-Croatian. In other words, citizens of the new states will identify themselves as speakers of Bosnian, Serbian, and Croatian, Slovenian, and Montenegrin, depending on their ethnic or religious background. While these languages are mutually intelligible, that means speakers can understand each other, they focus more on what separates them and prefer different orthographies or even different writing systems to emphasize their diversity. In short, what used to be considered dialects of Serbo-Croatian before the disintegration of Yugoslavia are now considered separate languages. The second case study concerns Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein. And it's the opposite scenario, where in all its non-standard dialects across the so-called German-speaking world, what connects these countries is that they share the same national language, German. In reality, the dialects of German vary so greatly that without standard German, many dialect speakers from different regions of these countries would find it difficult to understand each other. This is particularly compelling in the case of Switzerland, down here, a country that is interesting for its own linguistic diversity with 4 official languages. So the majority of the Swiss speak German, about a little bit less than 70%, and they have a French-speaking region in the west, Italian in the mountains, and a Romance language spoken by a small minority near the Italian border, the Romansch Grischun. So, while over 70% of Swiss citizens speak German, their particular Swiss variety, or Swiss German, is particularly difficult for many other German speakers to understand because it varies greatly in vocabulary and grammar, word formation, and sentence structure. Swiss children who are German-speaking Swiss need to formally learn standard German in school. It is interesting that in spite of the great variation in dialects, the national languages of Austria, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein, a tiny sovereign city-state between Austria and Switzerland, they call their language German. In fact, in the case of Swiss German, linguists have been debating over decades whether it should be considered a separate language or a dialect. In the context of different national entities, it would be conceivable to distinguish Austrian, Österreichisch, and Swiss, Schweizerisch, as separate languages because the variation on the basis of linguistic features alone would warrant such a classification. But in comparison to the Balkan region, there has not been any desire to emphasize the regional linguistic differences. It is in a sense the opposite of Balkanization. People in this highly linguistically diverse region may well consider German a symbol of what unites them historically, culturally, and politically, even though they may not be able to understand most non-standard varieties of the language they consider their own national language. So what we call a language is not an easily definable entity. As these 2 case studies show, language cannot always be equated with the peoples who speak them. The names of languages and nations can change depending on the historical, political, or cultural circumstances in which they exist. On the other hand, speakers of one and the same language can unite speakers of vastly different cultural experience. For instance, English in the United States, India, or Nigeria, while others who inhabit the same region of the world insist on different languages that represent cultural difference. For instance, Bosnian, Serbian, and Croatian, Slovenian, and Montenegrin in the Balkan region, even though the degree of linguistic variation may be very small. What we consider a language is therefore not an entity that depends on linguistic features alone, but a very complicated concept with geographic, historical, political, and cultural dimensions, as you will see in the future units of this course.